Good morning, friends. I again welcome you for our next lecture on poetry. Friends, in the previous lecture, we discussed the different definitions of poetry. We discussed the important elements or features or characteristics of poetry. After that discussion, now we know that poetry is something which is different from prose. Poetry is a metrical composition. Poetry is a musical thought. Poetry carries emotions, thoughts, ideas, and it is full of imagination. We have discussed all such definitions given by different poets and critics of English literature. And in this lecture today, we want to discuss the classification of poetry. William Henry Hudson, in his book An Introduction to the Study of Literature, has discussed basically the two types of poetry. He has classified poetry in two major divisions. You can see on the screen, there are some types of poetry written here on the screen, like sonnet, like elegy, like ode, like ballad, like epitaph, and all such types of poetry. But before that there is a basic classification of poetry which is done by W.H. Hudson, and this classification is, on the one hand you have subjective poetry, and the other hand you have objective poetry. Subjective poetry is also known as personal poetry. Here on the screen there is a typing error, subjective or impersonal. It is not impersonal, it is personal poetry. Subjective poetry is also known as personal poetry, and objective poetry is known as impersonal poetry. In the subjective poetry, the poet tries to express his own personal emotions, personal feelings, and that becomes a subjective poetry. Here, what the poet feels about something, some idea or some person or a particular event in his personal life, that is expressed by the poet. When we were discussing the definitions of poetry, we discussed one definition given by a romantic poet called William Wordsworth. Wordsworth defines poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Poetry, according to William Wordsworth, is the expression of strong emotions. It is the expression of powerful emotions. So here Wordsworth is actually talking about the personal type of poetry or subjective type of poetry. And most of Wordsworth's own poetry, own poems which he wrote in his lifetime, they were all subjective poetry, they were all personal poetry. I think when you were studying in first or second semester, you studied one of Wordsworth's very famous poem called Daffodils. In that poem, the poem begins with the lines, "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats over high, over hills and vales, beside the lake, beneath the sea." Okay, This is how the poet is expressing his own pleasure, his own experience of wandering just like a cloud among the trees, among the beauty of nature. So the poet expresses his personal feeling of pleasure, delight in his poem Daffodils. So you can say that Daffodils is a subjective type of poetry, it is a personal type of poetry. Most of Wordsworth's poetry, or you can take the example of Shelley's poetry, most of these poetry is subjective type of poetry. Another important type of poetry is objective poetry or impersonal poetry. Now, impersonal poetry is what? Impersonal poetry is the poetry in which the poet observes the society. The poet observes the human life and he, as an external agency, presents it in his work of art, in his poetry. That becomes an impersonal poetry. The poet tries to express here his own ideas, views as an external agency on a particular topic, on a particular event, on a particular element of nature. That becomes an objective poetry. T.S. Eliot, one of the most important poets of the 20th century in English literature, Thomas Stearns Eliot, he, as a poet and as a critic, has given the definition of poetry in a different manner. He goes against William Wordsworth. When he defines poetry, he goes against William Wordsworth. And he says that poetry is not the expression of the personality of the poet, it is an escape from the personality. I repeat it again, here you can read it on the screen also. Poetry is not the expression of the poet's personality, it is an escape from the poet's personality. Further, he says that poetry is not the expression of emotions, it is an escape from emotions. So T.S. Eliot wants to suggest that true poetry is not the one which expresses the poet's personality. Poetry is different and the poet is different. Both are different. Once the poetry is written, the author is dead. That is the new thinking of the 20th century English criticism, that the author is dead. Once the work of art is created, it is produced, it is published, or once it is written, the author has nothing to do with the creation. So, T.S. Eliot wants to say that poetry does not express the poet's personality, poetry does not express the poet's emotions. True poetry, according to Eliot, is an escape from emotions, it is an escape from the poet's personality, and that you can say is an impersonal poetry, that you can say is an objective kind of poetry. Let's go back to subjective poetry. Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, as said by William Wordsworth. If we talk about such subjective or personal kind of poetry, then the question is, what are the personal kinds of poetry in English literature? Here you can take the examples as you can see on the screen, that lyrics are mostly subjective poetry. When you are studying in first year, you studied the lyrics, and at that time I think we discussed that lyric is one which expresses one emotion of the poet. So that is a personal expression of the poet. So that is subjective or personal poetry. As an example, you can take Daffodils written by William Wordsworth. Even an elegy. Elegy is also a kind of subjective poetry, because in elegy, the poet tries to mourn the death of a person. The poet in elegy tries to express his own personal sorrow in his poetry. That is called an elegy. Break, break, break. It is a poem. It is an elegy written by Tennyson. That is a subjective kind of poetry. Another poem, Elegy written in a country churchyard, written by Thomas Gray, is also a subjective kind of poetry. So lyrics are mostly subjective. Elegies are mostly subjective kinds of poetry. We have also some meditative or some philosophical kind of poetry, and they are also subjective poetry. In meditative poetry, the poet, as if we feel when we are reading that poem, we feel as if the poet is meditating on a particular idea. And we as the readers, when we read that poem, we also start meditating on that particular idea which is expressed by the poet. And that meditative poetry is also subjective kind of poetry. In the same manner, sometimes some poets talk about some philosophies, some serious philosophies in poetry. Such philosophical poetry is also known as subjective poetry. For an example, you can take one poetry written by Lord Alfred Tennyson during 19th century, during Victorian era. Alfred Tennyson wrote this poem, Palace of Art. This is also called meditative or philosophical poetry, and such meditative or philosophical poetry is also known as subjective kind of poetry. Let's go back to discuss another major kind of poetry, that is objective or impersonal poetry. In objective poetry, you can believe that most of the ballads written in English literature are objective in nature. I have given you an example, one ballad written by the poet called Scott. Scott has written this poem, this ballad, Eve of St. John. Okay, this is also an objective poetry. Why? Because it is a ballad, and most of the ballads are objective poetry. Morris has written another objective poetry entitled as Shameful Death. So this is also an example of an objective or impersonal poetry. Not only this, in the list you can also take the epics written in all literatures, because in all literatures, all epics are mostly objective kind of poetry. There is an objective presentation. The poet presents his thoughts as an external agency. So epics, the Greek epics like Iliad, Odyssey, and an English epic like Paradise Lost, all these are the examples of objective kind of poetry. In objective poetry, we may also take narrative poetry. Narrative poetry means what? Here, the poet tries to narrate the story or narrate a particular event. Okay, here the poet has enough scope of narrating a story. When we are reading that narrative poetry, We feel as if we are listening to a story, we are reading a story when we are reading a poem. Geoffrey Chaucer, who lived during 14th and 15th century, in fact, he is considered the first poet of English literature. Geoffrey Chaucer has written Canterbury Tales. This Canterbury Tales is an objective kind of poetry and it is a narrative type of poetry. Meredith is also a poet of English literature and he has written Lucille. This Lucille is also narrative by nature. Within this objective, under this title of objective poetry, we have also one type of poetry called dramatic poetry. And dramatic poetry, it does not mean a drama, okay? It is much different from drama. A dramatic poetry is one in which, dramatic qualities are imparted to poetry. Here, some characters are presented and these characters are given some dialogues. Okay? In poetry, the characters are there and they are speaking some dialogues. The whole poetry is written in the form of dialogues. And that's why such poetry is known as dramatic poetry. Macaulay, an important poet of English literature, has written the poem called Ivory. In the same manner, Lord Alfred Tennyson has written the poem called The First Quarrel, and S.T. Coleridge has written the poem called The Ancient Mariner. These are all called dramatic kind of poetry and objective kind of poetry. In the same manner, we have also another type of poetry in objective poetry, and that is called dramatic monologues. Mono means one, and log means speech. We have two words like dialogues and monologues. Di means two and mono means one. So dialogue means the conversation between two persons. That is called a dialogue. Okay? And monologue is a speech delivered by one person. In English literature, some dramatic monologues are also written by the poets like Robert Browning. Robert Browning is known as the great exponent of dramatic monologues. In dramatic monologues, one character is presented in the beginning, and this character speaks some dialogues, and his dialogues, he delivers a very long speech, and the whole poetry runs in the form of speech by that character. So that is called a dramatic monologue. So dramatic monologue is also an objective kind of poetry. The Last Ride Together, written by Robert Browning, is a nice example of objective poetry. So you can also classify the poetry in these three groups also, like you have lyrical poetry, you have dramatic poetry, or you have narrative poetry. Let's repeat all these definitions. Narrative poetry, it tells a story and it has the elements of a story. And often narrative poems have a proper rhyme scheme also. Okay? Here the poet tries to narrate one particular event or one story from the life of a character. Another one is called a dramatic poem, right? Dramatic poetry. This is a poem where the speaker is someone other than the poet himself. Okay? The speaker is not the poet. The poet creates one character out of his own imagination, and that character speaks in the poem. A dramatic poem often includes characters and dialogues. A dramatic monologue is often from a fictional character's point of view. The next division or the next kind of poetry, in fact the first one which we discuss, is lyrical poetry. It expresses the emotions, it expresses the personal emotions, feelings of the poet, okay, and it is personal by nature, and it is also known as subjective poetry. So friends, here we come to the end of this discussion on the types of poetry. Mainly, let's repeat it again. Mainly, there are two divisions. One is the subjective poetry, another one is the objective poetry. In subjective poetry, we have the poems like lyric, like sonnets, okay. In objective poetry, we have the poems like epic, we have the poems like we have dramatic poetry, we have dramatic monologues, we have narrative poetry, and so on. I hope the idea is clear to you. If you have any doubts or questions, feel free to ask me. For the time being, we end up the discussion here. Rest of the things we will discuss in the next lecture. Thank you. Have a nice day.